I've been studying the feeding of the 5,000 from Matthew's Gospel the last few days, and there are some fascinating aspects of this particular miracle that connect with the Old Testament as well as look forward to the Lord's Supper. So I can't wait to share some of those with you in this video. Basically, what I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes is how the feeding of the 5,000 is the Exodus Recapitulated and the Eucharist Anticipated. So it stands between the events of the past and the events of that which is yet to come. It's backward-looking typology and forward-looking typology as well. So we're going to unpack that as we go through this particular narrative. To begin with, I want us to think about a couple of Old Testament prophets and what they did in connection with what Jesus does in the feeding of the 5,000. One of these is obvious, Moses, and one of these might not be as obvious, and that is Elisha. So we're going to talk about Moses more as we go through Matthew's account of the feeding of the 5,000, but just keep in mind that it was Moses who in the wilderness was the one that God used to give the people manna and to give them quail. So the feeding of God's people by Moses is central to understand what happens with Jesus in the feeding of the 5,000. But there's also another feeding miracle that is not as well known, and that is connected with the person of Elisha. So let me read you a section from Kings that tells about a miraculous feeding that was done by Elisha. This is from 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 42 and 44. A man came from Baal Shalishah, bringing the man of God bread of the firstfruits, 20 loaves of barley and fresh ears of grain in his sack. And Elisha said, "Give to the men that they may eat." But his servant said, "How can I set this before 100 men?" So he repeated, "Give them to the men that they may eat. For thus says the Lord, they shall eat and have some left." So he set it before them, and they ate and had some left, according to the word of the Lord. Well, the parallels here between what happens with Elisha and what happens with Moses, or what happens with Jesus, are pretty obvious, right? Elisha is giving to the people that which they need, but it doesn't look like there's going to be enough. But according to the word of the Lord, according to this power of the word of God to multiply this food, it happens. And not only is everyone satisfied, but they actually have some left. Just, of course, as happens with the feeding of the 5,000. So why is this important? Because it positions Jesus in the prophetic tradition. Jesus is, of course, more than a prophet, but he is a prophet. He is the prophet like Moses that Deuteronomy chapter 18 talks about. And so to understand much of the ministry of Jesus, we need to understand the prophetic ministry that served as the blueprint for his own ministry. So by reading about people like Moses and Elisha and Elijah and Jeremiah and Isaiah and others, by reading about these prophetic lives, we are reading that which is going to prepare us better to understand the actions and the words of Jesus. Okay, so with that said, let's jump into Matthew chapter 14 and talk about various details within this particular miracle that are going to look back and are going to look forward. To begin with, the setting. Where does this take place? Well, we're told that Jesus crossed the sea, and then he was in a lonely place in a wilderness, and then he was surrounded by hungry people. Well, that ought to sound familiar because that is the setting of the Exodus, right? It happens after the Israelites cross the sea, and then they're with Moses, and they're hungry people surrounding him, needing to be fed. So the very setting itself is setting us up to understand that what happens in Matthew is an Exodus type of event. Well, how does Jesus respond? He responds with what the Greek calls splagchnizomai. Love that Greek verb, just the way it sounds. But it doesn't mean just compassion. It means like a gut-wrenching mercy towards someone in need. It's the same verb that's used to describe the splagchnizomai that the Samaritan had for the man on the road to Jericho. So splagchnizomai is this gut-wrenching, gut-twisting mercy and compassion that someone has for someone in need. That's what Jesus has for the crowds, not only here, but also in Matthew chapter 9. And it's Matthew chapter 9 where we're introduced once more to another Moses theme, because Jesus has compassion on the crowds because they are like sheep without a shepherd. Well, Moses is the one who gave us that particular metaphor. If you go back to the book of Numbers, it's near the end of Moses' life, and he is concerned that when he dies, who's going to take over the leadership of Israel? Who's going to bring them into the promised land? And he worries that they will be like sheep without a shepherd. And so he introduces the metaphor. Jesus picks up on the metaphor and makes it his own. And so we have another connection. Jesus has compassion. He's worried about the people. They're like sheep without a shepherd. And so he acts as a shepherd to take care of the people during their time of need. Well, when does all this take place? Well, the time frame is also important. Not in the morning, not at noon, not in the afternoon, but in the evening. Why the evening? Because it was during the evening hours that God brought manna to the people, and it was during the evening hours that God brought quail to the people of Israel as well. Well, this new Moses in this new wilderness is about to do a new thing, but he does it in an old sort of way, an old time frame, we might say. He does it at evening. That's when he's going to feed the people. Now, if you go back to Exodus chapter 16, you'll read at the beginning of that chapter that the Israelites, when they were hungry, what did they do? Well, they did the Israelite sort of thing, right? They bellyached, they grumbled. They were ready to go back to Egypt where their bellies were always full. I doubt that. I doubt they were always full there, but that's what they said anyway. So they want to go back to Egypt where we had plenty of food. Well, when you compare with that with what happens in Matthew chapter 14, it's interesting because the Israelites who are there with Jesus aren't the ones complaining. They're not the ones who want to go back to Egypt. But who takes their place is sort of the disciples, because the disciples want to get rid of the people, right? They want to send them away back to the villages to take care of themselves, to buy food for themselves. And so Jesus says, no, we're not going to send them away. These people are right where they need to be. They're with me. And so in fact, he says, you give them something to eat. This, I think, is basically Jesus' way of saying to his disciples, hey guys, remember the Exodus? Remember what God did for the people of old? Well, that's about to happen again. And I and you, we together are going to make it happen. It's kind of like Isaiah chapter 55, where we have this invitation for those who are hungry to come and to buy with no money food to eat. So receive food for free. That's exactly what Jesus is about to do here with his disciples. Okay, so what kind of food is he going to give to them? He's going to give to them, of course, the bread. He's going to give them multiply the loaves, and he's also going to give them fish. Okay, bread and fish. Well, if we think with our Old Testament minds back to the book of Exodus, the bread's pretty obvious, right? Because manna is bread from heaven. And so Jesus gives them bread, this new sort of manna that he's going to now give to the people to eat. But what about the fish? I mean, is there some kind of Old Testament parallel there between the giving of the fish and what happened in the Exodus? Actually, there is a couple different ways that we can approach this. One is to draw a parallel between the quail and the fish. I know they're very different animals, very different meat, but here's what's important. When we are told that God brought the quail into the camp of the Israelites, we're told very distinctly that he caused a wind to blow and he brought the quail over the sea and into the camp of the Israelites. So the quail are, as it were, food from the sea. They're meat from the sea. That's one way to draw a connection between these two. But there's also another way, and this is related to a Jewish tradition, which postdates the New Testament, but is nonetheless significant and could have been a tradition that was circulating in the first century as well. We know from an early Jewish commentary on the book of Numbers called Sifrei Numbers, chapter 95, that there was a tradition that when the Israelites worked their way through the wilderness, something that was called the well of Miriam followed them, providing them not only with water, but miraculously with fish as well. Let me read this short section to you from Sifrei Numbers. Even if you gave them, the Israelites, even if you gave them all the fish in the sea, they would grumble. For is it because they have no fish that they are grumbling? Did not the well of Miriam accompany them in the desert and supply them with more than their fill of fish? It's only that they are looking for a pretext to abandon the Lord. So that's a tradition, that this well followed them, and the well had fish in it, and that those fish fed the Israelites in the wilderness. So maybe that is another connection here that we can make between what happens in Matthew chapter 14 and the Exodus traditions. Now, Jesus tells them to recline on the grass. The Greek that is used there is the verb that's used when you recline, when you lay out on a mat in preparation for a banquet. This was the Roman way in which they didn't sit in chairs, they reclined at the table. Well, what is Jesus doing basically when he tells them to do this? He's telling them, listen, I'm about to prepare a table before you in the wilderness. I'm about to prepare a feast before you. Where there is no food, I'm going to give food. Where there is hunger, I'm going to provide satisfaction, more than enough satisfaction. In other words, Jesus is saying, listen, what all the prophets predicted, I'm about to fulfill. All the prophets talked about how in the Messianic age, what would happen? That which was dead would come alive. That which was dry would now have rain. That which before had no hope is now going to be filled full of hope. That which was a barren wasteland is going to be turned into an Eden-like garden. That's what Jesus is doing here. He chooses to do this in the wilderness on purpose so that we, with Isaiah eyes, with Jeremiah eyes, with Hosea eyes, with these prophetic eyes, can see, aha, I now see why Jesus is doing this. He's feeding the 5,000 in the wilderness because he's fulfilling this vision of the prophets about the messianic new creation that is going to come as a result of the work of the anointed one of God. Okay, now, so we have a lot of backward-looking stuff so far, right? We have the Exodus recapitulated. All these Exodus events are now being done over by Jesus in order that he might be the one who provides a new Exodus for the people of God. But there's also what I called the Eucharist Anticipated. So what I mean by that is that if you look at the Greek from these verses, Matthew chapter 14, 19, and 20, if you compare that to Matthew chapter 26, verse 26, which is the institution of the Lord's Supper, there are no less than 6 parallels in the Greek between what is described, how Jesus is described feeding the 5,000 and how Jesus is described about to give to his disciples the bread of the Lord's Supper. So rather than showing you in Greek, what I've done is given you the English quotes, and I've put in bold all the words that in Greek are going to parallel between these two sections. So let's take a look at those right now. Matthew chapter 14 says that Jesus ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass, and taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing. Then he broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. Then, moving on to the institution of the Lord's Supper, Matthew 26. Now as they were eating, Jesus took bread, and after blessing it, broke it and gave it to the disciples, and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." So these two particular sections share a lot of common vocabulary. This is the way in which the gospel writer and Jesus are making sure that we draw a connection between what he does to the feeding of the 5,000 and the institution of the Lord's Supper. So I think what's going on here is this. We are accustomed to thinking about all these various meals in the Bible as isolated events. You can kind of think of them as pictures. There's the picture of the tree of life. There's the picture of the manna. Excuse me. There's the picture of the giving of the fish. The giving of the quail. There's the picture of the showbread, the bread of the presence. There's a picture of the Lord's Supper. There's a picture of the end time banquet, the Messianic feast. Rather than looking at all of these as kind of isolated pictures, put them all together, superimpose them one on the other, and what you're going to see is basically what I like to think of as the Lord's long supper. That beginning with creation and then culminating in the new creation, he's always been feeding his people. He's always, out of mercy, as our Father, been giving us that which we cannot give ourselves. He's feeding us. He's taking care of us. He's giving us life. He's giving us forgiveness. He's giving us his presence. He's giving us all of these things that we need in order that we might receive this life from him, the only one who can give this life to us. So when you think about the Lord's Supper, don't think about it in isolation. Think about it as part of this long meal of God in which he is always providing that which he needs, that which his people need, and indeed provides for us yet today. Okay, so if you're still with me, we're gonna wrap up here with 2 more details. One is how many baskets were left over, and then how many people were there is the other. 12 baskets left over. I suspect the 12 baskets are probably symbolic of the 12 tribes of Israel. And now this bread that was left over is going to be for them. This is a picture of God's ongoing provision for his people, the believing community, the Israel of God, which began already at the beginning and then continues even now in the believing community of the church. And then secondly, we have how many people were there. We have the 5,000 men, and then we have it says not counting women and children. Well, why would Matthew add that? This is his final way of tapping us on the shoulder and saying, hey, this is an Exodus event. Because if you go back and you read Exodus chapter 12, when it numbers the people, it doesn't count women and children. So the Hebrew there in Exodus chapter 12 and the Greek here in Matthew chapter 14 are both tying these two events together. Well, that's it. Thank you so much for listening. And if you're preaching on this Sunday, I hope that it provides you with some ideas that you could maybe incorporate into your exposition, into your proclamation. And if you're not, if you're listening to a sermon, or if you're just interested in the scriptures, I hope that it has provided you with more insights into all of these various connections between the Old and the New Testament. And I pray that all of you are well. I pray that God's peace may be upon each of you, and that together with all the church, that you too may continue to receive the bread of life, Jesus Christ, who gave himself for the life of the world. Thanks for watching, and peace be with you all.